Welcome to our guest tonight, and welcome to you, Erika. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I know that the university is moving on. You're at the end of your semester and you're taking a break, and I really appreciate that you're taking some time tonight to talk with us. Erika joined us in October for our conference on privatizing public education. She was one of our excellent panelists. And what we realized immediately, Erika, is that we gave you no time. You had a very little bit of time, and we had a lot of people who really wanted to hear more about your research and the things you've been doing. So we asked you to come back tonight and to schedule some time with us. So we're really, really pleased that you're sharing your knowledge and your with our community, because nothing could be more important right now. As two women who have gotten our education and benefited from it, I think we know the value of what happens in your life when you can get a sound basic education. And privatizing our schools is threatening that for some of our kids. But I want to take a few minutes to brag on you a little bit. You are the Thomas Willis Lambert Distinguished Chair, Associate Professor of Law over at the University of Chapel Hill. You have your areas of expertise that will really come through tonight: school reform, public policy, race discrimination. I've heard you speak several times, and I've been so impressed. I could not wait to meet Erika Wilson in person. And I saw where you were selected for a presentation at the Harvard Yale School Junior Faculty Forum in 2016. And I think our guests can look here and see the other honors that you have received. Each year, somebody has awarded you, 2016, 2017, you got a scholarship from the UNC School of Law, and now you're in this distinguished chair, which is what an honor for you. Yeah. It's very competitive. It's not done very often, and to be sitting in a chair position like this at your age is pretty remarkable. So I'm impressed. Now I want to go ahead and jump back, if you will let me, Erika, to talk a little bit about why we had this conference and how you came and added into the conversation. So school privatization is a concept that refers to the things that happen, policies that are made that shifts money and students, from the public sector into the private sector. And some years ago, when we would talk about privatization, people would kind of roll their eyes and not really know what we were talking about. But now I'm really happy to say that many people in our state, many of our elected officials, and many of our public school supporters, and many people in policy like you do know that this is a real phenomenon. It really is happening. There are policies and programs that have really made this happen, charters, private schools, and that we see that this corporate takeover of our public schools has been a very thoughtful, coordinated activity that's been going on in North Carolina and across the state for decades. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of talk about that a little bit. And I kind of pulled together some of the things that we've identified as legislative actions that have occurred that have added into privatizing our schools. And I wonder if, when you look at this, if there's anything that strikes you or anything you wanted to mention that you think is important in your conversation tonight with us.
Yes, so I think if you look down the list, a number of these, the changes over the last 10 years are troubling. But particularly if you look, you can see the cap of charter schools. Back in 2008, the state used to cap the number of charter schools that could exist at 100. Now there is no cap, and so I'll talk about in a few minutes what that has meant. Similarly, the existence of virtual charter schools back in 2008, that wasn't a thing. Now it is. And so also the decline in the percentage of students who are in traditional public schools going down from 90% to 80%. All of those are the residual effects of the privatization movement.
And one of your presentation tonight that we asked you to kind of delve into and show us some of your research on is around how all of this is going, racial segregation as well is occurring through this privatization movement. I'm going to shut up here and let you kind of talk a little bit about your slides and your research.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's really, I'm happy to be here and to share this information. So I want to start by contextualizing the privatization movement. So I think one thing I always like to point out is that we see a move towards privatization in public schools in North Carolina and nationally, really, and that education is just one of the areas where we're seeing a push towards privatization. We also see it in employment with contracting out, et cetera. But with respect to education specifically, it's important to understand the context of how we got here. And so I like to point out how much the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, the role that it's actually played in getting us to this moment where we see more privatization in public schools. Some people, such as myself, argue that the privatization movement is actually an example of government retrenchment in response to Brown. The Brown case required that Black and white students be provided equal educational opportunities. And so in the aftermath of Brown, there were many tactics tried in order to thwart that, from closing public schools. In Virginia, they closed the entire public school system rather than integrate the public schools.
Wow.
And so the idea was, well, if we have to integrate, we just won't have public schools. But the Supreme Court found that that was not constitutional. So they had to reopen the schools. Another tactic was to use this freedom of choice, where they said that students could choose where they wanted to go to school instead of being assigned to schools. And so we see a little bit of that today with the privatization through charters, and I'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, the Supreme Court in 1968 said that offering students freedom of choice instead of affirmatively integrating schools was also unconstitutional, given the history. It meant that students would rarely choose to go to a school where they were not in the racial majority. So that mechanism of responding to Brown was deemed unconstitutional. But the larger point here that I've raised in putting this slide up is to contextualize the privatization movement, to suggest that some of the privatization that we are seeing is a response to Brown versus Board of Education, a retrenchment of the government so that the government is not providing equal educational opportunities, and instead is shifting the burden to the individual family or parent to do so. And so the direct roots of that, I argue, lie in the response to Brown versus Board of Education. So next slide, please. And so in addition to government retrenchment in response to Brown, the other context needed to understand privatization is the narrative that was created about traditional public schools. Mm-hmm. So a narrative was created that our public schools are failing, that public schools are failing to produce workers who can adequately serve the economy, that our students in public schools weren't learning enough to do well enough on test scores, that we were falling behind other Western countries in terms of the educational outputs, the level of education that our students were getting in public schools. And so there's a really good book, if folks haven't seen it, by Chubb and Moe, called Politics and Markets.
I went too fast on you, I'm sorry.
Yes, Political Markets in American Schools. And it talks a little bit about this narrative and suggests that one solution to the failing public schools is to resort to the private market, to introduce market-like forces in how we disseminate public education, because the market can do it better. Right. And so underlying this idea that the market can do it better are three things. This idea that if you inject competition into the school selection process, that will force schools to improve, right? That if schools are forced to compete against one another, then the fittest of the schools will survive, and those that are not so fit will fall by the wayside. They'll be closed down, or students will not choose those schools because they're poor schools. The second underpinning of the privatization movement is this idea that freedom of choice or liberty, that people should have the right to choose where they want to go to school instead of being assigned to where they want to go to school. And the last sort of ideology underpinning this is this idea of individualism, that each individual student or family should try and find the school or situation that works best for them, that we're not so concerned with the groups of students, but individual students, what works best for an individual student. And ideas of individualism support the idea that this is supposed to be a good thing. So the combination of competition, liberty, and individualism are really the normative underpinnings of the privatization movement, and why folks tend to argue that privatization is a good thing. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about privatization, or when I talk about privatization in particular, I specifically focus on charter schools. And so in the context of charter schools, what I'm going to talk about next are the racialized effects of privatization generally in charter schools specifically. I noted in discussing the first two slides, gave some context for the privatization movement, but important also part of this is to understand that privatization impacts all students, but it particularly has a detrimental impact on students of color. And so when I talk about privatization in charter schools, there are three things worth knowing about charter schools. And so the first thing is that charter schools disentangle school assignment from residence. And so enrollment is by choice. That means that parents, students get to choose to enroll in a charter school rather than being assigned to a charter school based on where they live. And so some people have suggested that this might be a good thing, that we might be able to get more racially integrated schools this way, to the extent that our schools are segregated because where we live is segregated. But that's actually not what has happened, and I'll talk about why that hasn't happened. And so and with some of the more popular charter schools, there are often more students who want to enroll than seats available. So a random lottery is used to select which students will enroll in a school when that happens. The other really important thing to note about charter schools in particular is sort of what they are. So they're publicly funded schools, but privately run. They can be run by nonprofit, different entities other than the state can run the charter schools. The rules are relaxed, they're different. They have non-unionized teachers, for example. They might have longer school days, and so the same rules and regulations that apply to traditional public schools don't always apply to charter schools. Right. And so the last really significant point that I want to raise, and this as a legal scholar, as a lawyer, this one's really important to me, is that because they are privately run, there's been some question about whether or not they are a state actor, and that matters because in order to make a constitutional challenge, let's say to a charter school, let's say we wanted to argue that the charter school was engaging in racial discrimination in the students that it accepts, or something along those lines, you would have to show that the charter school is actually a state actor, because the Constitution only applies to state actors. And because there's this hybrid of charters being publicly funded but privately run, there is a question out there about whether or not they satisfy the state actor requirement. And as I note on the slide, some circuit case law has found that some charter schools are not state actors and rejected constitutional-based claims. So that's important in terms of the legal remedies that might exist for the kinds of racial segregation that I'm going to talk about. So next slide, please. And so generally, it's important to understand, right? I mentioned earlier that privatization can detrimentally impact all students, but when it comes to race and privatization, there are some specific things worth noting, right? The idea undergirding privatization is that if we inject market-like forces into the school assignment process, I talked about earlier this idea of individualism, liberty, etc. Those are all market-based principles. And so when we think about markets and race and what race does to markets, the story gets more complicated. And so one important thing to know is that as public schools are increasingly enrolling more students of color, that there is some semblance of white flight, which makes the race and markets issue a little more complicated. And so I'll press pause on that and come back to that in a subsequent slide. But just generally in terms of race and markets, one of the things that the marketization of public school assignment does is it shifts the focus away from principles of equity to market-based rationales, right? So we're no longer concerned with fairness as far as groups are concerned, but we're more concerned with our individuals being able to make choices that individuals want instead of looking at the group-based effects of a market approach. It therefore encourages individualism and self-advancement. And so by that, I mean, it encourages parents to think about more what's best for my own individual child or student and not consider the impact of their choices on the group as a whole. And most importantly, I think it allows for more government retrenchment. It shifts the burden of finding a quality school away from the state to the parents, right? So parents are are the culpable party in terms of if your child is not in a high quality school, then it's the parents' fault for not choosing a better charter school or engaging in this market process to find a better school rather than the state's responsibility to make all schools good schools. And so
that is powerful. That is a very powerful concept, and I don't really know that I've thought about it in these terms as much. You're absolutely right, because I think of it a slightly different way. I'm always saying to parents, don't leave your public school if it's not doing what it should do. Demand that it provide what is needed. Advocate that you have the constitutional right to the school being improved and work to fight and improve it. Don't let the state off the hook. So that's my way of saying, kind of a very thoughtful research concept here is this shifting to now parents have to run around and worry about where they're going to get an education for their kid. How crazy is that?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely insane. And then when you consider what it means for parents who don't have the same amount of actual or social capital to wade through the different choices or to even understand where to look to get the information to make a choice.
Make a decision, right. And charter schools, well, you'll get into the differences in terms of why that can happen, right, and why it's so unequal, because there's those issues around transportation, food, access, location in the state or the county or the city. So there's a whole lot more there. Okay.
Yes. And so along those same lines, when we think about the move towards more marketization, the other thing that it does is that it masks a form of racial subordination that exists when we move towards privatization. And when I say racial subordination, what I mean by that is a situation where parents of color, particularly low-income parents of color, are in a worse situation than they were or are in terms of traditional public schools and some of the sort of equity gaps that might exist there. And so the reason that when we move towards marketization and charters, the racial subordination, in some ways, some people such as myself have argued is worse, is because it's the racial subordination is masked as a choice, right? That parents have. It suggests that parents of color, particularly low-income parents of color, have forms of choice that they don't really have. They're illusory choices. When you look at charter schools, for example, that serve predominantly low-income students of color, there are a limited number of high-quality charter schools that serve low-income students of color, but you wouldn't know that just by looking at, let's see, mainstream media sources. Often the handful of charter schools that are doing well or improving test scores are put out as the face or front of why charter schools are such a good thing. But the reality is that those charter schools often are woefully oversubscribed. They have way fewer seats than they do students trying to get into them. And the reality is instead that you've got a bunch of other charter schools that are actually performing worse than traditional public schools and that are filled with predominantly low-income students of color. And so another aspect of this is that in order for parents to effectively choose, it requires certain kinds of social and actual capital that many disadvantaged families of color don't have. And so I'll give a personal example because I have an 8-year-old son. And so I live in Durham, North Carolina. And so charters and choice in Durham, North Carolina is a big thing. And so to even engage in the choice process requires one to go online and to fill out certain paperwork to get the application, to figure out if you have gotten in. It also requires you to know what options exist. In order to know what options exist, there's a public school fair, but to figure out that there's a public school fair, you have to talk to folks, you have to be online, and so these kinds of things that parents may not intuitively know, and not everyone has also consistent access to the internet to engage in the application process. Some schools do allow for a paper application process. What that means, you actually have to physically drive down to the school and fill out the application. Another barrier that might prevent people from doing it. But the social capital, I think, is the biggest piece of it, because a lot of what parents learn about schools, they learn from other parents, they learn from other people and their social networks, to the extent that your social networks are people who are like you. If you are disadvantaged, maybe your social networks may be similarly disadvantaged, and so there may be an information gap in terms of what folks know. And a lot of the school choice choices in particular is by word of mouth. I mean, I can consider myself a pretty knowledgeable person on this issue, and I have to confess, as I was waiting through the process for my 8-year-old son, there were schools that I'd never heard of, processes I knew nothing about, and so It made me really think long and hard about how much social capital plays into this whole choice process.
And how to even evaluate, right?
Right.
You know, it's not like you can you know, buy a Pepsi and buy a Coca-Cola and taste them and say, I can evaluate this pretty good. I can see it, I can taste it. It's a very simple thing. But how in the world, there are so many parents I've talked to who did everything they could to make the right decision. They made a decision and then they came back later and said, I had no clue to ask all of these questions that I didn't know, because this is, my first child. I had no clue that these are the things I should ask about in terms of training of the teachers, and things I should want to know about the curriculum, and things I should want to know about suspension and expulsion and discipline. I've had a lot of friends whose grandchildren have been kicked out of charter schools. And they said we would have never gone there if we would have known there were these kind of policies. So it's really, to me, like also tying someone's hand behind their back, even in the best circumstances. How are you supposed to know, and who do you hold accountable?
Right. No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think the point about not knowing what it is that you should be looking for is a good one. I think that that happens across the board. But when you think about disadvantaged families in particular, the information gaps are even worse.
Right.
Okay, next slide, please. And so as a result, what we have here is that we have this a wide range of charter schools. I always like to emphasize this point because the proponents of charter schools always hold up the charter schools that are oversubscribed, but that everyone wants to get into. But there are also this marketization leads to some predatory behavior, which results in low-income families of color in particular being preyed upon. And so the example I used in the slide is that there are some charter schools that do things that offer incentives for enrollment. So this one in Indiana was offering parents a $100 gift card incentive if they would enroll their children in in that particular charter school. And so the reason they do that is because the charter schools are funded by enrollment. The more children who enroll, then they get money that would ordinarily go to the traditional public school. They get that money per student. And so there's an incentive for some unsavory charter operators to try and draw students in. This specific example I used here in Indiana, the charter school actually wound up closing down in the middle of the school year. The flip side to that is this picture here, which is a picture of many students and families praying that they get into one of the Harlem Success charter schools in New York. And so you have a wide range of the oversubscribed charter schools where there are only a few seats. And it's actually pretty disturbing that all of these people are sitting around praying that they get into a lottery for a school when we could use those resources and efforts to better the traditional public schools rather than people having to be on a wing and a prayer that they're going to get into a school of their choosing. And of course, this screenshot was taken from a film, and it shows when people didn't get into the charter schools, they're devastated and crying as if their life is over. And so it's really I think a sad commentary on what the privatization and marketization of public schools has turned us into.
And think about how devastated the children feel. You know, adults have adult skills at dealing with emotions. How would you like to be that little fellow in the middle who thinks now his life is over? He's not going to get in there a high quality charter school when he deserves all of those services in his own public school. And that's a real heartbreaking.
Right. And so one thing to consider about this, if you go back to that slide, the picture with the little boy and the other families. So we see pictures like this, but what we rarely or ever see is a photo like this with the majority white parent and student population praying to get into a good school, right? And so the flip side of this is that in predominantly white communities, we tend to have fewer charter schools. And so this is true in North Carolina, it's true nationally, that the privatization and charter movement has a specific niche in more racially diverse areas or areas that are predominantly students of color. And so that leads to my next point, next slide please, is that another ill effect of privatization and charter schools is that it allows white families to continue to pick white schools. So the journalist Nicole Hannah Jones once said that racial segregation in schools is a choice, and that the reason our schools are segregated is, for the most part, is because white families continue to choose racially segregated schools. And if you think about it, most of our efforts to integrate schools have been centered around forcing white families either not to flee or not to engage in or not to go to private schools. And so what does this have to do with privatization and charter schools? Well, for starters, research consistently shows that white families consciously seek schools for their children that will place them in the racial majority. And so when I presented this in the past, people inevitably say to me, well, isn't it true that white families are just picking schools that are of higher academic caliber, et cetera? And I say, but subsequent research has shown that no matter how high a hypothetical school's test scores were, how new the buildings were, how safe the school was, the likelihood that white parents would choose the hypothetical school for their children dropped significantly as the proportion of Black students in the student body increased. So there is a definite correlation between racial composition of the school and the choices that white parents tend to make. And so as far as charter schools are concerned, this matters because, next slide, please.
Wow.
In racially diverse areas, what we're starting to see happen is that white parents are using charter schools as a way to avoid racially diverse public schools. And so the slide I have up was a study that was done that showed that there were nearly 750 charter schools that were whiter than their nearby school districts. So what the numbers are showing that is that when you have a racially diverse school district and you and a charter school is established, that the charter school can put in place certain rules that will make it more likely to attract a predominantly white student body. And so I've written a piece called The New White Flight, where I track this phenomenon where white families are fleeing to charter schools within racially diverse school districts as a way to avoid racially diverse traditional public schools. And so next slide, please. I parse out some examples and I call them white charter school enclaves. So if you look at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg public schools, for example, you can see that the district itself is fairly diverse. And so in the district, there's the Charlotte-Mecklenburg district is somewhere around 35% white, somewhere approximately in that range. And so the three charter schools I've given as examples on this slide, the Pioneer Community School, more than doubles the percentage of white students, right? That school is nearly 80% white. The Charlotte Lab School is somewhere around 65% white.
Wow.
And the Bradford Preparatory School is similarly somewhere around 64% white. And so these are concrete examples of instances where the charter schools are effectively serving as white flight hubs, places that white families can go to flee a racially diverse district. And so I have two more examples, not to single out Charlotte-Mecklenburg because it's not limited to that school district.
Right.
My home county, Durham County Public Schools, you can see a
Same
similar
thing.
result. Yep, same thing. The percentage of white students in Durham Public Schools is somewhere around 18%, 20%, something like that. You
Greater, yeah.
see the wide variation in these charter schools. And so the next slide has, I think, the most drastic difference. No, I took that one out. But yes, you can see that with the with charter schools, one potential impact is that they can serve as enclaves for white family students who wish to avoid racially diverse public schools. And so I said earlier I would come back to this question of why disentangling residents from where one goes to school, it wouldn't be a panacea to creating racially integrated schools. One of the reasons that is because white students and families consistently pick predominantly white schools. So when given a choice, an unfettered choice, what we see here with the white charter school enclaves is more likely to happen, and it's less likely that we're actually going to get racially diverse schools. The other flip side to that is that if you look at, let's say, take the Durham charter school examples I've given here, some of the, I mentioned earlier that charter schools have different rules, sometimes more relaxed rules. And so one of the ways that a charter school might get a predominantly white student body is by putting in place rules that serve as a deterrent to students of color, particularly low-income students of color. So examples of that might be not offering transportation. Charter schools are not required to offer transportation. So some of the schools on this slide don't offer transportation, or if they do, offer a very limited version of it.
Right.
Some charter schools also do not offer free and reduced lunch. They don't have to, and so not offering free lunch is a way to deter low-income students of color in particular. And finally, geographic location is a big one.
Right.
If you don't offer transportation, or you're located in a predominantly white area or someplace that's far and difficult to reach, then you're also likely to get a white student body. And one more that's actually not talked about enough, some charter schools might also put in place a specialized curriculum that's tailored to people with, let's say, higher forms of, or more social capital. So the Excelsior schools, a Latin-based school, right? And so this sort of caters to a certain socioeconomic demographic who might be interested or have knowledge about that kind of curriculum. And so that's another hidden
Well,
way. We see that with Montessori
right.
project-based schools as well.
And in Raleigh, we have a charter high school that basically it tells everyone who applies and that you have to have already successfully completed Math 1 in middle school or
Wow.
higher
Wow.
if you're going to be successful, right? That if you haven't completed Math 1, then you'd have to do that on your own in the summer or something, right? Because what
Yeah.
they're making, and I've had a couple of folks tell me they've actually gone to the interview, the application and the interview to see what's up, and what they were discouraged. They didn't tell them they couldn't apply, but they would say things like, well, this is what our successful students have to have as a basis. You know, you've taken a foreign language in middle school. You've completed Math 1. You have an interest in study abroad at least one semester in high school. These become very class-oriented issues, regardless of race, because it becomes, you know, who has those resources, what track the kids have been on for 8 years, and they're pretty much college bound. If you're not heading for an extensive college career, this is a very, very rigorous program that you would be crazy to put your kid in. But it's a charter school, and it is almost all white, and it is almost all upper middle income, middle and high middle and upper income levels, because they put all this on their, you know, they set this out, and then they make the parents feel during the interview that their kid didn't have a chance. And so once again, we're putting the parent in this role of not wanting to make the wrong choice. And, you know, wanting to do something different, being told that these charter schools are a better advantage. This is what your kid needs. If you're a loving parent, you're going to go get this. And so that's to me, it's almost criminal.
Right. And it gets to the issue of skimming, that charter schools, because they can do things like require an interview or application, can skim students who they perceive to be easier to educate, and that actually results in traditional public schools clustering students who may have more disadvantage, and so that makes it even more challenging for traditional public schools to provide the kind of education that all students deserve to have.
And maybe some of these charter schools are having great success, but you know, when Chris Norsom presented with you at the panel that day, he had a couple of slides that were very clear that on average, right, charter schools were not doing better on standardized testing. Whether you know, like with the test scores, you know, they use or not, which you know, it doesn't matter. When they looked at how the kids were doing in terms of the A through F, when they were looking at how kids were doing on proficiency levels, that traditional public schools were outperforming overall charter schools.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I think the tendency is to point out a handful of charter schools that are doing well, but to not recognizing that that's not representative of all charter schools.
Right. And of course, you know, we've also heard at the conference a lot of parents who came up to the microphone to ask questions of the and so forth. And one of the things they kept saying is, I thought this was an advantage for my kid. My kid got pushed out. When it got close to testing time, my kid was encouraged I should return to public school where they could get some tutoring and mentoring. So the public schools, I think it's important to say that the public schools take all children and at any time. So, you know, you get pushed out of a charter school mid-year and you've lost that academic opportunity, but then you come back into the traditional public school and it might feed into the data that shows kids aren't doing as well, when it's actually not true. It's the kid has been put at a disadvantage for an entire academic year. So, wow, yeah. This is really astonishing. And Erika, tell me, an original statute that authorized charter schools, did you talk about you should be representative of the community you're in?
Right, that's right. So the law in North Carolina used to be that charter schools were required to try and mirror the demographics of the district that they're in, but that was removed. That language was removed, so that's no longer a requirement. And so that's one of the things that advocates have been pushing for to try and address this white charter school enclave issue, is to put in regulations that require charter schools to make efforts to mirror the demographics of the area or the district in which they're located. And so I think that could go a long way. I also think doing things like requiring charter schools to provide transportation and free and reduced lunch would go a long ways too towards alleviating some of these or not.
Isn't that an argument? Yeah, you're making the argument. You know, on the one hand, when charters were set up, it was to be more flexible, more nimble, be experimental, innovative, try things, and then share them back with all the other teachers and the other school systems. Of course, none of that has happened at all. There was nothing. We just looked at all the new charter schools coming in for the last 3 or 4 years. Nothing innovative, nothing different that's not offered in the same school district. Nothing being transferred. There's no reports of best practices and things that worked that are being prepared and sent back to the public school system. But the thing that's really disturbing is that there's also no way to deal with schools that aren't doing a good job. Everybody keeps talking about taking over public schools when they're not performing, but have you seen anyone doing anything to take over or close down charter schools that are not serving our kids well?
No, I mean, and that's a good segue to my next point about the legal implications of this. And so the legal consequences of choice, right? And so when we think about, there's the issue that you mentioned in terms of trying to close down charter schools, but there's also, what do we do about the racial segregation in charter schools? And so there are Supreme Court cases that say that when schools are racially segregated because of choices made by parents rather than state action, then there's no constitutional violation, basically. And so when you have a situation where parents are being encouraged to choose in certain ways, they're actually immunized from constitutional liability, because it's not the state assigning students to schools, rather it's parents choosing a particular charter school, let's say, for their child. And so those patterns, those white charter school enclaves that I showed you earlier, are
Right.
unlikely to violate the Constitution, because this is a matter of parents choosing to send their kids there. And cases Missouri versus Jenkins, Freeman versus Pitts, make it clear that racially segregated patterns that are a result of parental choice, choices in housing even, are not subject to constitutional scrutiny.
Wow, that works out pretty nice for them.
So I always like to conclude with some thoughts on, where do we go from here? So in terms of potential solution, so the courts, I think courts are never an ideal place to go, right? I mean, I think ideally we want to implement effective public policy and not rely on litigation in order to fix the problems with our schools. But I think that particularly with charter schools, whether it's an issue of whether or not they're providing quality education, or whether or not they're serving as conduits for racial segregation, I think there is a role for courts to play in terms of lawyers coming out with innovative arguments and strategies to challenge certain patterns of racial segregation in schools, or the ways in which charter schools are or are not providing a sound and basic education for students in the state. I think that it's a very necessary course of action to take, to consider court-based challenges that are outside of maybe the traditional federal constitutional challenges. We have a robust right to education clause in the North Carolina state constitution. As we talked about earlier today, we got a great report out of the Leandro case, finding that everything that we've been saying about funding disparities and lack of quality educational disparities are accurate. And so I think it's time to consider a Leandro-like litigation aimed potentially at charter schools in terms of what is or is not happening in terms of provision of quality education.
Well, Erika, I want to ask you a follow-up question really fast before you move off of this. So this has always been worrisome to me. I think that if we know that the research has shown over and over again that children who are in segregated schools by race or income do not have as many successful outcomes, if we know that it's a deterrent to a sound basic education, it seems like you're right on, spot on, to say that that is another avenue that we're not providing our constitutional obligation, right? I mean, there are lots of things that can, in the Leandro case, we'll see that it primarily focuses on funding. Funding is not equal, and therefore, because it's not equal, it's going to have impacts, and people can kind of intuitively understand that pretty quickly. And although we've had to go to court to prove it, and now we've had to go through 2 decades of annual reviews and sidestepping, but now we're back again with another independent review on the WestEd report saying, yes, funding has an impact, and it impacts people differently, right? It really called out poor kids, kids of color, kids who live in high poverty, who go to high poverty schools, segregated schools, for the most part, are being impacted in much more profound negative ways. So I like your thinking here. I can't understand why that wouldn't be the same argument.
Yeah, so I mean, it's harder on the racial when you start to make arguments about race and the race in particular, and class too. to be blunt about it, there has not been great case precedent in terms of what you need to show on the race angle. You need to usually need to show some form of intentional discrimination in order to state a claim, let's say, for a violation of the federal or state constitution. But I do think it is an interesting angle to tie it into the sound and basic education requirements. But that's a little bit.
What about the passed last year allowing 4 cities in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County in the Charlotte area? There was a legislation that enabled them to set up their own charters,
right,
and to give preference to residents in those cities. Did that make any sense to you in terms of these issues?
No, it made no sense. It's clearly going to exacerbate racial segregation in schools, and it's going to allow municipal charter schools that are giant white flight charter enclaves is what's going to happen. I do think in that instance, there's maybe a possibility that there can be some constitutional challenges, effective constitutional challenges to that piece of legislation. I think that when the first municipality actually takes the legislature up and actually creates that municipal charter school, I look to see litigation challenging that both on federal and state constitutional grounds.
Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please come on.
No. And so then the other potential solution are charter school laws. And so I hinted at this. I mean, the first thing I would say is that charter schools were always meant to supplement, not supplant traditional public schools. I think that where we're at now, I don't know if it's pragmatic to suggest that charter schools will ever stop existing. So I think where we're at now is that charter schools need to be better regulated in order to allow them to serve the role they were initially envisioned to serve, which is to, again, supplement, not supplant traditional public schools. And so what does that mean? It means we need a cap on charter schools. Again, I think, at least, I think the removal of the cap was not a good thing. It's meant an infusion of charter schools that aren't necessarily providing a better education than traditional public schools, and are serving as what, in some instances, serving as conduits to allow further racial segregation in schools. So I think in terms of charter laws, a cap on charter schools would be a good place to start. I mentioned also changing some of the requirements that charters, in terms of what they are not allowed to do, requiring charters to provide free and reduced lunch, requiring charters to provide transportation, and including language back in the charter legislation that will require charter schools to mirror the demographics of the area in which they're located, so that we don't have such a disparate result where we have charters that are located in these racially diverse areas or districts with and the numbers are way off in terms of the percentage of white students in those charters versus the percentage of white students in those areas. So those are a couple of concrete ways in which we could think about re-envisioning charter school laws in order to get at some of the equity issues that I've discussed.
I will say to you that some of the school board members I talked to around the state, one time I said to them, well, if they start providing free and reduced lunch and they start providing transportation, isn't this just going to add to the unfair competition with your school system? And their point is, no, well, maybe, but who knows? But the more important points they say is that we're giving them the money to do that anyway. They get to take of our local supplement. They get money whether they've earned it or not. Meaning, if Wake County gets a grant, the Wake County provides more local funds. If Wake County collects taxes from the state that when there's court cases, fees and fines go to the school system, all that money has to be shared with the charter schools, whether they're providing services or not. And
Yeah.
so they're like, hey, they need to join us. And if they're going to get the money for this, they should be providing the same services. If they get money for food and special programs that we do, even if they don't provide them, we think they should provide them, or they shouldn't get the money. So they have kind of an economic argument, and it makes sense. And they also think that for charters who are not well organized, not very thoughtful, only in it for the money, that they have to really think that it might deter them to making this kind of investment if they're not really serious about being effective.
Right.
Yeah, if it's just let's open up a daycare and make some money, and let's not worry about educating the kids, kind of a philosophy. So that's very very interesting. And the thing about the charter schools that one parent said to me, just yesterday, she left the charter school, came back to the school system this year because she went to the charter school thinking she was getting the same product she got in a public school, found out that her son's teachers were not certified, had not been to school education, really did not know much about teaching math. They were just good in math as students. And they were working as math teachers in a charter school with no certification in that field. And so she was appalled. So that was another example I have to share with you about how parents sometimes can't make the very best choices. They don't even know all the rules.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So you mentioned the Andro case. When you look at that, and we'll getting close to the end of our time, so we'll wrap up. But when you look at that, what is the most hopeful thing that you think can come out of this Wested report that makes recommendations or remedies for fixing our out of balance system when it comes to providing a sound basic education? What's the most encouraging thing you see there?
I think the most encouraging thing is that we have an independent report that has confirmed what many of us working on these issues have known for a very long time. And so I think the Leandro litigation or case has been a long, winding road. And so the fact that we've got a pretty detailed report that lays it out bare, the deficiencies and the areas in which we need to do better, I think just having that, the product itself, gives me some hope that possibly the powers that be will listen and make changes. I mean, when you see the gaps and disparities, and to realize that the quality of education a child will get completely depends on whether or not they're born in an urban or rural area, the zip code they're born into, etc. It really, not to sound too hokey, it calls into question the American dream in terms of being able to use education as a means of advancing oneself. So I guess my hope comes from, again, the fact that we have the report that's laid bare what the facts are. And I think it's a lot, the fact that it's an independent report will hopefully help to dispel any idea that this is a politically motivated narrative, et cetera. We can get to the business of doing what we need to do to fix the disparities.
Well, and you know, every once in a while, I look at some of the things that are going on with educational funding and some of the impacts that are working against our children, and I can't get why the public, why our business community, why our legislators do not feel compelled to make every child be successful.
Right.
Every child to grow up to be a productive member of society, pay taxes, vote, be a part of the labor force. Replace, as we all are aging out, replace our doctors and mechanics and nurses and school teachers and restaurant owners, small business owners. All these people have to come from the next generation to be educated. So it always profoundly impacts my spirit to think that we aren't making what should be good economic decisions. At worst and at best, what's in the best interest of the common good that we all hold as Americans, as people of this country, that we said that people have held that public education is a gift, a right, and it amazes me how we are failing on this. I'm going to be like you. I'm going to be hopeful about this report, that maybe it's a new foundation, a new book to stand on. It's a very 300-page report, so it is kind of like a book, but to stand on, that we can go into the next decade and really start as a public, as a people, as parents, educators, Grammys, as attorneys, as just citizens and voters, ask that our public education system produce kids who can be productive, and that we do it in a cost-effective way. What we're doing now isn't even cost-effective,
Right.
And so I hope that that's what's going to happen. So I will say this: I would hope that, since you mentioned the report, people will go to our website, Public Schools First NC. We're going to have a special page on the Leandro ruling, the West Ed report, and the history of the case and key findings. And I encourage our public to educate yourself, to really be thoughtful about this. Find out what's going on, read about it, see what you think about the recommendations, and be a part of the advocacy to make sure that we do what every child in this state, in this country, really deserves. And you know the drill. Go to our Facebook page and like us and keep up with the information that's going on. Erika, I want to give you the last word. You have spent your career so far invested in improving our educational system. Any advice for people who are listening in tonight or who will watch this in the future about how they can be a part of the solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just close by saying that this is really a we issue. I mean, I think sometimes it's easy to make myopic choices based on your individual child and what parent doesn't want to do what's best for their own child. But these are really all of our children, and we are going to pay now or pay later for failing to properly educate all of our children. And I think particularly the move towards privatization is a cheap, quick fix for people who are more fixated on their own individual child's well-being. But I think our fates are all intertwined and interconnected, and that it's really important that the quality of public education that we provide all of our children matters in terms of our future, where we're going to go. So I would just encourage people, as you said, to be informed, know what's going on, and to really think about how one's individual choices affects the collective, because it's a we problem, not a you or me problem.
Well, you've just said the most perfect ending. I thank you so much for being a part of this tonight. I look forward to working with you again in the future. Please keep us informed as you publish your works and as you create more presentations that we can educate our parents with. Please share them with us. We'll put them out there. We want our public to be able to make their own decisions, and we think it should be data driven. So you're a part of that, and we appreciate it. And thank you so much, Erika Wilson. It has been a joy to get to know you, and I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Good night.
Good night.